welcome Thomas and Tanja to what is the 10th year of the Centennial Speaker Series, and welcome all of you. This is a relationship between a town and the university that's like no other, and I think it's rare anywhere. And we're tremendously appreciative, and we love coming out here to give talks. But we also want to say that Thomas and Tanja were instrumental in getting this set up in the first place and in its continuance. I'm not going to give lengthy biographies because I think most of us know Thomas and Tanja, and if you don't, you will shortly. But I do want to say that this all goes back to when Thomas was a new faculty member and built a relationship with the University of Wyoming and with global and international studies, with the Center for Global Studies, with our colleagues across the university. Again, that is like no other, and continues even in their work from Freie University of Berlin, where, if you don't know, I'm going to tell you, they are remarkably distinguished professors, have held some of the most substantial grants and awards possible in international studies. So things to bear in mind. I want to introduce, since one of the things that happens out of our relationship here is Centennial support for a number of students to pursue their research internationally. And I want to just say that we've got some scattered through the audience. If you're a student who was supported through the Center of Global Studies, could you just stand up? All right, and so now, as I said, I'm going to get out of the way fast and just introduce the topic, which is we've been pursuing international challenges all year. And very much on all of our minds, I know, are Kyiv, Moscow, Beijing, Gaza. And of course, what Thomas and Tanja may have planned a month ago may be changed by things that happened yesterday. Completely unexpected things. So, as I say, I'm going to get out of the way, and it's your show.
Quick question, does anybody want these overheads off?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Wow, this is really exciting. It's always been exciting, but this year it's particularly exciting because it's the 10th time that Thomas and I have the pleasure to give a talk at the library, and I cannot really remember what the first talk was on. It was probably on foreign policy, but we talked about so many things. We talked about the pandemic. We talked about COVID. We also talked about the migration crisis in Europe. We talked about Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. So we have covered a lot of ground, and this year we kind of try to draw not everything together, but we still talk about things that are going on in the world and that keep us busy, particularly, but not only as political scientists. So since there are some elections coming up in this country, we thought we're gonna talk a little bit about the challenges, the international challenges any president, any 47th president of the United States, whoever he or she may be, will have to deal with, right? And give you a little bit of an idea what we see as these challenges, what are these challenges about, and how well prepared the US is also in its relation with other countries, particularly its Western allies, in dealing with these challenges. This is pretty much, Thomas, can you just click, just to give you an idea of what you can be expecting. So we have sort of structured it into two parts. We will start by sort of mapping out the international challenges to US foreign policy, irrespective, as I said, whoever is going to be the next president. And these are just a selection, right? They're pretty prominent. I think you are all familiar with them in one way or the other. And the second part talks a little bit about what we call the home front of US foreign policy, as I said, to look at how well is the US prepared in responding to these challenges, right? So at this point, let's start. Thomas, thank you. Let's start with the first one, which is still very much on our minds. And despite the fact that Ukraine has entered the territory of Russia recently, I I still want to remind everyone that this war is a war against Ukraine by an increasingly aggressive Russia under President Putin, right? And it is not the first war in Europe after the end of the Second World War. Let's not forget about the war, the Yugoslavia wars. But it's certainly the bloodiest war we had in terms of the casualties. So far, it's 500,000, and that's just an estimate, right? It's a massive war, and it's ongoing, and it's not likely to end anytime soon. What is interesting about this war is the way it is framed by the different actors. Particularly the Europeans like to frame this war as a war that is about democracy and freedom. And that's certainly true. It's about the freedom of the right to collective self-determination of the Ukrainian people to live according to whatever script they choose, and the script they chose is liberal democracy. But let's not forget the invasion by Russia of Ukrainian territory is a blatant violation of one of the key principles of the international order as it was established after the Second World War, and to which subscribed almost all countries of the world, liberal or not. And by liberal, I don't mean liberal in the American sense. By liberal, I mean democratic, right? So it is a blatant violation of one of the core principles of international law, that is, you do not invade other countries, certain exceptions permitted, of course. So you do not change borders by using violence. So this is a clear war of aggression that involves a lot of war crimes too. Okay, now why is Putin waging such a war? And this is what we talked, I believe, last year. He claims that with NATO enlargement eastwards and also the European Union pushing its borders eastwards, this encroaches on Russia's national security interests. We have argued this is foremost a threat to Putin's political survival as the leader of Russia. So wherever any of its neighbors, of Russia's neighbors, is turning democratic, that is an immediate threat to Putin's regime survival, and therefore, Putin's regime is becoming ever more a threat to its neighboring countries, which increasingly aspire to become liberal democracies. Okay, so that means a lasting peace at European Union's borders is very unlikely as long as Putin is in power, right? Secondly, any ceasefire, it's not about seizing territory to Russia. That might be part of whatever deal, but such a deal is unthinkable without giving Ukraine a security guarantee. Because we have ceded Crimea to Russia in 2000. I mean sort of everybody, the Ukraine and the West went along with it, essentially given it to Putin in 2014. Has it stopped him from invading the rest of Ukraine? No. So, simply making a deal with Putin will not do the trick. The Ukraine needs to have a security guarantee, and the cheapest way of doing that actually would be to accept Ukraine into NATO. At the moment, it's not in the cards, but the European Union, much to the surprise of a lot of people, I don't know, but Fedini is also a very prominent EU scholar. I was very surprised by the EU offering a membership perspective not only to Ukraine but also Moldova and Georgia. Let's not forget Ukraine is at war, right? And now they're negotiating their way into the European Union. So the EU has already made that commitment. I don't think it's completely unthinkable for NATO to do the same, but that would be the key. The EU is not capable of giving Ukraine security guarantee it would need. Why should the US care? There are some people saying, this is a war, Europe's problem. Why should the US be concerned about what's going on in Europe with regard to the war? Now, this war is of huge importance, and probably of greater importance to Europe than to the US. True, because it's right in our border. However, let's not forget that the economic interdependence between the US and Europe is high. So if Europe's economy is tanking because of that war, that has immediate effects for the US economy too. Secondly, we are allies. We are all in NATO, right? The US has just pledged to station missiles in Germany, first time after the end of the Cold War, right? So there is a military alliance here. And of course, we're also political allies. And finally, this is a about sort of re-establishing the international order. I'm not talking about the liberal international order. I'm talking about the international order in which one of the core principles is that you do not invade other countries. And I think to keep up that principle is in the core interest of the US, because it does not only affect Ukraine, it affects all countries over the world, including Taiwan. And at this point, Thomas, I hand over to you.
Okay, thank you. Switch. Okay, we switch topics now in 5 minutes. So every 5 minutes you get another word or So next topic is the increasing rivalry, conflict, or whatever you want to call it, with People's Republic of China. In our view, this is very, very different, actually, from the relationship with Russia. And number one, and you see that on the graph there, this is the trade balance between the US and China. And what you see there is that trade imbalance. Where does this come from? It comes from supply chains. China is manufacturing tons and tons and tons of goods that are then sold or finally assembled or whatever in the United States, and that this is reflected in this huge trade deficit. That hasn't really. It has. You see, I mean, it's kind of flat. It goes up and down a little bit, but it hasn't changed that much. So what's the relationship here? First of all, there's of course a clear political rivalry. You have a liberal democracy versus an increasingly repressive autocracy. And that increasingly repressive autocracy, and we're going to talk about this in the next. Tanja is going to talk about this a bit, is trying at the moment to assemble an anti-Western coalition. And in the rest of the world, you have a lot of fence-sitters at the moment. Yeah, looking, not taking sides, etc. Secondly, we have an increasing security dilemma in the Indo-Pacific region. Tanja just talked about Ukraine. I think one of the reasons why the US went in rather forcefully in aiding Ukraine has not just to do with Russia, but also with China. There's a signaling issue going on, and it's called Taiwan. Don't even think about doing something, all right? But it's not just Taiwan. I mean, the situation in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, etc., is really, really volatile because of all kinds of disputes. And then, last not least, and I'm coming back to the economic interdependence issue, what we are seeing on both sides now is what two scholars from Washington, D.C., Abe Newman and Henry Farrell, have called weaponized interdependence. And the idea behind that is we always thought, economic interdependence, the more the better. Yeah, because that prevents wars, etc. Now, if you have asymmetric interdependence, and this is what is this graph, you can actually weaponize it. You can use it for your interests and your purposes. So we're seeing this by now on both sides, and we'll see how this goes. The second point here is that the US is pretty much what we call an offshore security balancer. So the US is, of course, on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, but I mean through its alliance with Japan, with South Korea, and also more indirectly with Taiwan. The US is, of course, an absolute major player in the Indo-Pacific region. Last but not least, this is also a potential area of conflict with the European allies. Because the European allies are not completely comfortable with a situation where the US the U.S.-Chinese relationship is nothing but conflict and nothing but rivalry. And by the way, and I always try to figure out a little bit about what would be U.S. interests. The idea that you can completely decouple from the Chinese economy is probably a complete nonsense. Because you want to buy a smartphone that is halfway affordable. You want to buy all kinds of consumer goods that are manufactured in China. Look at the trade relationship, you know. So if you talk about real decoupling, really severing the trade and economic ties, the consequences, by the way, for both sides, would be absolutely devastating. We can talk a little bit about the Chinese economy. The Chinese economy at the moment doesn't look too good. The second U.S. interest, of course, as the U.S. is a global economic power, again, South China Sea. This is not just, you know, somewhere there, but this is where most of the world's trade goes through. So if we have a major war in that area, it's going to have an immediate impact on the economic security of pretty much everybody. There's also the international order issue. You know, does it really make sense to have China as a complete rival that in fact tries to destroy or change or whatever an international rule-based order, and once again the maintenance of the Western alliance in all of this. And let's not forget, some of the most important U.S. allies are actually in Asia. I mentioned Japan and South Korea. Okay, so that's the next piece on the inbox of the 47th U.S. president are the wicked problems of the Middle East. In our field of social sciences, what do we call wicked problems? Wicked problems are such where there is fundamental disagreement on actually what the problem is, how to explain it, and what to do about it. That's a wicked problem. Yeah, there are other wicked problems, but if you follow the news, you can pretty much know what I'm saying. So the latest round of these wicked problems started on October 7 last year with the Hamas massacre and the hostage taking. Then the Gaza war, by now massive civilian casualties, roughly, according to estimates, 80% of the buildings destroyed, all kinds of human rights violations, possibly war crimes. We can talk about this later on. But at the same time, don't forget the whole the Gaza Strip is one big, with the tunnels underneath, is one big military installation, coupled with 2 million people living there. Yeah, so this is wicked. You don't want to be an Israeli officer in this kind of situation. So it's really it's massive, the problem. You have a so-called axis of resistance led by Iran, plus Hezbollah, the Houthis, Hamas, and we're all waiting for the counter-strike of this group next week, next month. Don't ask me. I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen. Then you have the survival strategy of the Israeli government. If you look at the opinion polls, if there were elections in Israel today, this current government would be immediately out of power, including the possibility that some of the ministry, including the prime minister, will be arrested for some legal corruption-related and other legal issues. So there is some thinking that in fact a ceasefire is not in the interest of the Israeli government. But don't forget, at the same time, we also have massive political mobilization in Israel right now. So, consequences. At the moment, it looks like, and I can't tell you what is happening tomorrow in Qatar. We've been there, done there, got the T-shirt the whole time. Whether or not the two actors, Hamas and Israel, agreed to some sort of ceasefire. And before we do that, we can't even get to any kind of humanitarian solution, a political solution, whatever. The alternative is, of course, worse. It would be a wider regional war. And let's not forget, Israel has nuclear weapons. And Iran is very, very short of getting nuclear weapons. So there are nightmare scenarios here about the Middle East with all kinds of repercussions, energy, hello, for the global economy. This is again, our point is, this is not far away somewhere. This affects the US and Europe absolutely immediately. The US does have some leverage over the Israeli government. Probably the US is the only power outside Israel that has some leverage. The EU and the Europeans are deeply split on the issue, with Germany on one side, followed by 3 or 4 other EU members and others on the other side. So the EU is not an actor in that conflict at the moment at all. Okay, so it's outside. So what are the big US interests? As I said before, energy security is one, but also the fight against terrorism. This axis of resistance is not done yet. These are by now, these are not just some rogue terrorists. These are very, very, if you look at the weaponry, that both Hezbollah, not so much Hamas, but both Hezbollah and the Houthis have pretty advanced weaponry by now, and they are pretty well trained. So these are violent non-state actors that you should have some respect for. You can't just treat them as some rogue people. So that's a major issue. Change of subjects. Next one.
Next one.
We're going to go through this shortly, and then we have more time for discussion afterwards.
And that is something that is not as much in the attention of the media, but equally important. It's the relations with what we call emerging powers or emerging economies and world regions. The term Global South has become increasingly politically incorrect. And it's also problematic to talk about the West and the rest. But so what we're focusing on are countries that used to be developing countries that have managed to generate sufficient economic growth to get out of this category, but without actually being industrialized economies, fully industrialized economies yet. But there are emerging powers the world has to reckon with, and those include Brazil, India, and South Africa. Now, the one thing these countries have in common, other than their remarkable growth rates, is that they all claim to be liberal democracies, right? Unlike Russia and China, who don't even pretend, right? These 3 countries still claim to be sort of part of the West, if you define the West. I mean, it doesn't make sense to define the West geographically. Never been. It goes back to the Cold War, where the East-West conflict, right? Yes, there was an East and a West, but Japan, for instance, and Taiwan and South Korea are part of the West because they are, but what they have in common, the West has in common, is that they're all based on liberal democracies combined with market economies, right? This is what defines the West. And then there is some ideological underpinning, but, and Brazil, India, and South Africa have bought into that script for organizing their societies at different points in time, but all three still claim to be liberal democracies. Now that puts them in a slightly, I wouldn't say awkward, but it's sort of interesting position with regard to the West and China and Russia, with which they have joined, they come together in the BRICS, right? The BRICS country. That is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And BRICS is in the process of enlarging. They've accepted new members. Interesting choice. Don't have really time to go into it. But it's interesting because what this alliance brings together are clearly anti-Western countries like China and Russia, and countries who still want to be seen as part of the West because they claim to be democracies. So that makes them kind of fence-sitters on a lot of issues. They no longer automatically align with the West, for instance, when it comes to voting in the United Nations General Assembly. And it's also clear with regard to the war Russia has started against Ukraine, where they are not part of the Western sanction regime, right? And the way they justify it is that this is Europe's war. That is not our war. And on top of it, it's a very hypocritical war. Because, and I come back to the point I made at the beginning, the Europeans like to frame this war as a war over democracy, liberal democracy, right? The right to collective self-determination. Now, they essentially, and instead of saying this is about the international orders you guys have signed up to do and you should care about, namely the territorial integrity of a state, right? And interestingly enough, all three countries have territorial contracts, so they care a lot about that principle of territorial integrity. But no, the Europeans have made this a war about democracy, and so they say, look, this is your idea of democracy, you want to fight for this, you want to support the fight of Ukrainians for this kind of democracy. It's not necessarily our idea of democracy. We stay out of it. Plus, why do you care about democracy and freedom in the case of Ukraine and not about all the other places of the world where democracy and freedom is also violated and you don't do a thing? That is the whole point about democracy or compact in a moment. So for them it's easy to stay out and say, look, this is not our war. We stay out of it. We need to make our deals, particularly India, right? They actually benefit from this war because they get cheap energy from Russia, among other things. And they sell their weapons to Russia. So they make a lot of money by sitting on the fence. And the West makes it easy to them because we have made this our war, the war of the West against the anti-Western forces. And so everybody who doesn't necessarily want to be part of the West, not their war, not their problem. So that's the first point. The second point is it's very hard to envision any kind of solution to the really big global problems, including climate change. But not only, we're also talking about fight against pandemics. India is the largest democracy in the world, and I think the fourth largest country in the world, population-wise, right? These are big countries, a lot of population. So it's the economic weight, but it's also, in terms of people power, these are countries to reckon with. And if you think you can solve any of the big global problems without their participation and contribution, well, this is a big illusion, right? Finally, there is a lot of grievances these countries still have. Remember, they are former colonies, they are former developing countries, so they feel structurally disadvantaged, rightly so, I would argue, and so there is also an issue of global justice. So refusing to give them a seat at the table, an equal seat at the table, a table that reflects their economic weight, right, makes them even more fence-sitters, if not even, foot-draggers when it comes to global governance issues. So what follows from this is that the US and the West in general needs to take these countries seriously and engage with them. The G20 is one forum in which this happens, but, and this is the second point, they need to be given a greater voice in international institutions. A lot of the key international institutions, including the UN Security Council and the International Monetary Fund, are still very dominated by Western countries, right? And so these countries feel very much disadvantaged, not given equal weight, and this pushes them away from the West towards anti-Western powers, particularly Russia and China. And the third thing is avoid hypocrisy. We cannot possibly solve any issue in the world, yes, but we should be very careful in justifying why it is okay to invade certain countries, right, when others invade. This brings us in a very difficult situation, and usually it's the international institutions that authorize these actions. But, let's not forget, in the past, the West has invaded countries without any mandate or authorization. And now, of course, Russia turns around and says, why is it a problem when we invade Ukraine in defending our national interests? After all, you invaded a whole myriad of countries, right? And that was okay. And this needs to be approached. This needs to be argued out. Okay, so why should the US care? I think even if you believe that the US is still a large enough country who can do it on its own, I still think it's not in the interest of the US if the rest of the world unites against the US, right? And let's not forget, these are not small countries. These are economically powerful countries that matter a lot also to the US economy. Yes, I'm getting that. So I think the US needs to be very careful to come back to a situation in which the world is split between the West and the rest, right? And the West becoming ever smaller, or maybe the US at some point not even being part of the West anymore. There are global problems. The US certainly has an interest in those being solved, right? And you need these countries to address this problem. And finally, and that's not a small issue, and Thomas will talk about that in a moment, the base of US power in the world, of US influence, is not only its military and its economy, it's attraction, it's culture, right? Think about the Coca-Cola. I mean, the iconic things that people associate with US culture, that's soft power. People want to live in a society that looks like the US, right? And you're losing this soft power if you put off countries, if you don't respect these countries, if you don't engage with these countries. It's a much more powerful way to influence if you engage with countries, if you respect them, instead of putting them off and not giving them the same voice they think they deserve at the table. Okay, let's move on, Thomas.
Okay, a change of topic again. We discussed so far a bunch of issues that are in the inbox of the next president of the United States. And we could continue. We could talk about climate change. We could talk about the international repercussions of migration issues, etc. So there's tons of other topics that one could also talk about. However, if you think of becoming the 47th President of the United States, there's also something called the home front. Today, domestic politics and international relations are deeply interconnected. And a president that doesn't look at what is going on domestically will not have the wherewithal to do anything in foreign policy. And there we run into some issues. The first point is a country that wants to influence world affairs, not even talking about a superpower, but a country that wants to influence, have some say in world affairs, needs three things, the 3P: power, purpose, practice. I start with P. So scorecard, power, I'm sorry, the first one, power. If you look at the military side of things, the US military power is still unrivaled. Not because the US has more nuclear weapons than anybody else, that's not true. Not because they have more conventional weapons than anybody else, but the US is a truly global military power in the sense of having power projection capabilities across the globe. No other country has this, can do this. China is way, far away from something like this. So if military power is all that counts, don't worry. Problem is, military power does not necessarily translate into influence in world politics. Okay, you cannot bomb anybody. Everybody.
You can.
You might have trouble. So economically, the situation looks a little bit different already. If you want, the three big economic powerhouses in the world are now the US, Europe, and China. If you want to have GDP, gross domestic product, each of them roughly 20% of the world domestic product. So at that point, that is no longer unrivaled. In the 1960s, the US was unrivaled with regard to economic power. It commanded 40% of the world GDP, and of course we're way from that. And then my last point, this is Tanja touched upon this already, is the so-called ideational power, very hard to measure. Joseph Nye from Harvard 30 years ago or so wrote a book called That Soft Power. This kind of power of, it's very hard, really very hard to measure how you do this, but when there are some data on this, and if you combine them, the US is still doing pretty well. You know, US culture is permeating the entire world. And by the way, I suggest just visit Beijing, Shenzhen, or any other big Chinese
Moscow for that matter.
Moscow for that matter too. Yeah, if you don't know, okay, you can't. This is different letters, etc. But you see a lot of American influence in the way people behave, etc. So that is still, the US is still, it's not alone in that category. By the way, by one measurement, Canada is the number one in ideational power. But okay. So next point, US purpose, and here's where the problems start. If you look from the rest of the, if you take a picture from outside the United States, people start asking questions. What do you want in the world? We hear America first. We hear leader of the free world. We hear all kinds of things. It seems to be unclear what the US wants in the world and whether there's any consensus about this, and I'm coming back to this, among the political elites. And that is a major issue, because if you don't have a purpose in the world, all your power doesn't matter that much, because you don't know what to do with this. Last point, US practice. So what we observe is a kind of this might sound really interesting for you if you're following day-to-day politics, but if you look at it from a kind of 20 years perspective or so, you can see you get all right, let's say 2001, 2000, after 9/11, there was the Iraq intervention, very active unilateral internationalism, but starting from George W. Bush to the second administration, you get a long-term trend toward selective engagement and partial retrenchment. Yeah, it went from Bush 2 via Obama, Trump, the first Trump period was that on steroids. Biden, yes, very active as far as Ukraine is concerned. Did Biden do anything with one of the major issues in international trade policy? We didn't talk about this. The WTO, the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization is still not functioning. Biden hasn't done much. Is following essentially the same line as Trump. Sounds very strange for you. given the polarized climate. But it is not that the Biden administration has turned around everything in U.S. Foreign policy. Which brings me to the last point that I wanted to make. And this is connected to a sales pitch, to an infomercial. We observe that the domestic polarization in U.S. politics is an increasing constraint on U.S. foreign policy. Maybe with the exception of China, because that's the one issue the two sides still agree on. Now here comes the puzzle. And somebody sitting in the back there, Jean Garrison. Jean? Get it? No? Okay. Jean and Stephanie Anderson, who just wrote me that she wanted to be here, but she's going to be at the barbecue because of the weather, etc.
She's here.
Anyway, so Stephanie Anderson and Jean wrote a brilliant article in a forthcoming book. This is infomercial. And what they argue in this book is that actually the American public, if you ask them simply on issues, should the U.S. maintain global leadership? You have an overwhelming majority of Americans across the aisle, whether Republican or Democrats, in favor. The moment you insert the partisan division in these type of questions, the political polarization booms, overrides foreign policy attitudes. An example, war in Ukraine. Overwhelming majorities of Americans support military aid to Ukraine if that is presented in a neutral term. If you ask the same question in opinion polls, do you support the Biden administration's military aid to Ukraine? Boom! You have immediately that partisan divide. And that is, in our argument, is actually the domestic politics issue is the main issue that currently prevents the US from doing more in terms of purpose and practice in terms of global leadership. So the infomercial is a book that Tanja, Stephanie Anderson and Jean Garrison and I co-edited in cooperation with the University of Wyoming. It just came out with Oxford University Press, and it's free. It's an open access book, so you can just simply download it. All right, and there is the link, but you can also, if you just click that. The one thing I found out, for some reason, the US side of Oxford Press doesn't have the download link yet. Go type in you are in the UK or Germany, and you get on a different website, and then you can download it.
And if you buy it, we'll sign it.
You need to complete the infomercial because there's a book launch coming up.
Exactly. I was just about to say, on September 16, we will have at
4:30 in the Union Family Room.
Yeah.
We'll have a book launch, and it will start at 4:30 p.m. And we will. I was going to say something else. Hey, sign up to the CGS list, and you will get information about this event.
Invitation, and we tell you a little bit more about the fantastic contributions to this volume, because we have, for instance, a chapter on the evangelicals. A very interesting account of how the evangelicals contributed to liberal democracy. And when I say liberal democracy, again, I don't mean liberal progressive. I mean democracy, right? Not reduced to majority voting, but also the rule of law. How much they contributed and how their position has changed and why. We also have a fantastic chapter on black populism. And we have an even better chapter, not even better, but yeah. No, I'm not skipping this. I'm going to fast forward. And we also have a fantastic chapter on the role of the Supreme Court, who has always been a strong supporter of democracy in this country. So what I'm saying is you'll find some really interesting contributions which you not necessarily find in other publications. Okay, very briefly. we believe in changing perspectives, right? I mean, one of the great privileges to live in this community is to understand how Americans see the world. But maybe we hope we also give you some ideas how people outside the US see the world, particularly those based in Europe. So, and we also thought we want to end on some reasons for hope. Not everything is doom and gloom, right? There are a lot of challenges in the world. But so one of the big experiences of the post-Second World War period is that as long as the Western democracies stood together, we have weathered pretty much everything. No, to us this is important. And the good news is the West is still standing, right? I mean, despite all the talk that the West is falling apart, I mean, it's still there. The West is still the strongest and longest lasting security community in the world. What does that mean? It ain't a trivial thing. Is that countries that are part of the security it doesn't even occur to them to wage war against each other, right? And that is a major accomplishment. Think about how for hundreds of years, countries have fought wars against each other, and the West hasn't done this. And if we are right, it's not going to happen anytime soon. Okay, so that security community is still there. The second good news is that finally Europeans got the message. It's one of the very, very few good things about good things, but one of the positive effects of this war Putin waged against Ukraine is that the Europeans finally understood that there needs to be more burden sharing. And that is something Obama started, right? And it's not only an issue under the Trump administration, it started with Obama and has been an issue with each and every president ever since. And the Europeans finally got the message and apparently are willing to do something about it. And that includes Germany having stationed missiles on its territory without having a major debate. 40 years ago, Thomas went to the streets to protest against the stationing of US missiles in Germany. Today, it's Exactly. Well, okay, but he's become an E52 liberal anyway. So that is not. So I'm just saying, that is something. This is an important change. And economically speaking, the transatlantic trade area is still the most integrated, and economic interdependence between the US and Europe is the highest in the world. So the West is still strong, right? But there are also risks. And it's not only the outcome of the next elections, it's also what's going to happen in Europe. I mean, Italy, Meloni so far, right? She is the head of a post-fascist party, and she's been a good European so far. Domestically, we'll see. But there is some cause of concern. But there's France. We might actually see Marine Le Pen becoming the next president of France. And then we are in for some fun in Europe, I can tell you. Germany, the alternative for Germany is on the rise, but also a new left-wing authoritarian party. So, I mean, it's, the West it's eaten up not only from the outside, Russia and China, it's challenged also from the inside, and also in Europe. Okay, and the other risk for the transatlantic community is obviously China, as Thomas already said. The Europeans so far, it's been very hard to say no to Biden, right? I mean, Biden's take on China is the same as Trump's take was. So there won't be any big changes, irrespective of what the elections will go. But for the Europeans, it will make a difference, because it will be easier to say no to Trump than to Biden, right? So the potential rift over China in the transatlantic community may be influenced by who's going to win the next election.
Okay, final 2 minutes. I promise 2 minutes. Why should we care? So we talked about the inbox of the president. Why should people in Centennial care? Or Wyoming? Washington is far away, who cares, etc. Let's talk about the Wyoming economy briefly. 3 words: energy, 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 tourism, 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 and agriculture. The first 2 are completely dependent on international developments. Okay? And all the issues we talked about, Russia, Middle East, and to some extent China, have a direct repercussion on the Wyoming economy. So here's the data for 2023. Wyoming exported $2.1 billion worth of goods. Number one export partner is Canada. That is not surprising, but then comes Latin America and Asia, and that was my surprise part here. Europe is only coming afterwards. Latin America and Asia is much more important. Much more important. So that means exposure to the world is vital for Wyoming and its economic, political, and cultural future. And here's where UW comes in, because the University of Wyoming gives students at least one international experience. That may be a semester abroad, maybe going, on the various programs you have, but also to international research. And my last point is, and Caroline started with this, and I'm end with this, the Centennial Fellowships are exactly part of that vital contribution to this international research experience. And at the barbecue that follows this talk later on at our place, our annual barbecue, we're going to talk a little bit more about this. Thank you very much.
I'm going to introduce one more person here. We're going to get to questions in just a second. But I also want people who are specifically in international studies in the program at the university. So I know we've got Federico, we've got Jean, and whoever else. Could you just wave so people know other people that they can discuss all of our international issues with? And they're going to be at the barbecue too. So watch out for that larger community. And Nevin Aiken is a crucial part of that program. Nevin was hoping to be here this summer to talk to you about the faculty panel that was about sacred spaces and their challenges. And Nevin is an expert in conflict resolution, and particularly in Ireland, where I come from. So he wasn't able to do that. He was very busy, but now he's going to run the question period for us. But I also want to introduce him because he's working now in the President's office focused on experiential learning, which very often is international. So Nevin, I'm going to hand over to you, and we'll make sure that one microphone for these guys and one microphone for the audience.
Thanks everyone, and thanks everyone for being here this afternoon. As Caroline mentioned, my name is Nevin Aiken. I'm an associate professor in politics and international studies in the School of Politics, Public Affairs, and International Studies at the university. And just a couple of things out of the gate. Again, thank you so much to Caroline, the Center for Global Studies, also the Centennial Library as well, for putting on these incredible events for 10 years now, which is really, really wonderful. Of course, thank you so much to Thomas and Tanja for sharing some of these insights. And again, what a gift to have them here and as members of this community, and to be able to talk very quickly about some really big global events happening around the world, and to share some of those insights. And again, thanks to all of you for being here for these events. And I know many of you have been here over the years, are veterans of many of these Centennial Speaker Series events as well. And what really makes these events so rich, beyond hearing from Thomas and Tanja and some of the other speakers that take place, is of course the chance for questions and conversations with all of you, right? So I'm going to get out of the way so we can turn over to that, because it turns out we have a lot to talk about in about the next half hour. Just as a gentle recap, talking about some of the issues around Ukraine and Russia right now, the rivalry with China, Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the Middle East more generally, for those of you following events there. Of course, how we negotiate relations with emerging powers. And then last but not least, if that wasn't enough, thinking about US politics and polarization, how that factors into all of this, links with European partners, and then linking this all the way back to events here in Wyoming. And all of these topics that we're talking about, of course, have these impacts here, they have impacts in the United States, they have impacts in Europe, of course, but all these ripple effects, right, regionally and globally around the international community stability as well. And as was mentioned, right, these are also all events involving nuclear powers, severe concerns around energy resources, implications for the global economy and supply chains, and even the very nature of international institutions as we currently know them. So a lot to talk about here. So as we turn to questions, I think we have about 30 minutes. So just in terms of a little bit of housekeeping, we're going to try to wrap up by 6 o'clock. So we have time for some more informal visiting as well at the barbecue over at Thomas and Tanya's house afterwards. So just a couple of things with that. There are maps at the front desk that you can grab that'll give you directions on how to get over to that barbecue, because any conversation we don't have here, of course we'll have a chance for more informal conversation together afterwards, which is really, really rich. And also there's some feedback forms as well, which are really, really helpful for the Center for Global Studies, your feedback on these different events as well. So let's turn it over to questions. So I think maybe the best way to do it, if you just want to raise your hands, and I know we'll have lots of folks, and then we'll pass
turn the lights on again so that at least we see you better.
Say who you are.
Sure.
I'm Sherry Keller from Larrabee, and happy to be here. This is really, really great. A question on sanctions. You know, we're trying to do sanctions with Russia to try to influence that, and the whole notion of soft power. You know, I'm wondering. It's always hard to tell what's happening, what the feelings of the Russian people are, but are we creating anger and anti-West behavior through our sanctions rather than actually making a difference in influencing it?
You want to connect or?
Maybe we'll take one at a time.
Okay, yeah.
Turn the lights on.
The lights.
Okay, number one, Russian people. At the moment, very hard. In our research center in Berlin, we have a whole group working on Russia. At the moment, it's very, very hard to say because you are in a very, very repressive environment. And that means opinion polls and that kind of stuff doesn't tell you much. Okay? Because people might be afraid and the state is extremely repressive. The general impression is that that Russians tend to be very depoliticized at the moment, very subdued in the situation. Yeah, I mean you have to think that it has an impact. I mean, out of these 500,000 battle deaths are probably roughly 350,000 Russian soldiers, yeah, plus an amount of wounded people, etc. So a lot of families have that. I don't think the sanctions have much of an impact on this entire situation. Yeah, anti-Western feelings were there already before. As far as the Russian economy is concerned, these targeted sanctions did have some impact, but not the big impact, because you can divert. I mean, energy, for example, Russia was able to divert quite a bit. On the other hand, this is not an argument against sanctions. Even if they don't have this kind of immediate effect, but it does have a signal effect to somebody, to the rest of the world, that this is not that this type of behavior is something that you need to that you really put a really brake on. You know, international order does not simply break down because somebody violates the rules, but international order breaks down if somebody violates the rule and there's no reaction. So in that sense, I still support these type of sanctions, even though it is very hard to have a measurable impact and there's diversion and so forth.
Can I add 2 sentences here? Because, I mean, the impact of sanctions is very hard to watch, right? But I think, coming back to the hypocrisy, the West had to respond, right? one. Two, targeted sanctions. I mean, the broader population, it's not going to rise up against Putin because of economic sanctions, but the oligarchs and the so-called Siloniki, right? The close circle. If you hit them, that's the hope at least. But, and I want to clarify one thing. When we said, with Putin there won't be peace because his regime survival depends in a way on that war, that doesn't mean that we advocate for regime change in the sense of, right, there needs to be, there needs to be a democratic government, but it's very unlikely. So if Putin falls, he will be very likely replaced by a authoritarian nationalist, whatever. However, these people might actually be willing to end this war in order to consolidate their power once Putin is gone. That would be the argument. But let's make no mistake, there is no democratic majority, no strong democratic opposition to talk about in Russia that could be empowered by these sanctions, right? I think there you're absolutely right.
What do the Europeans think of Kamala Harris now? Someone who has very little experience in foreign affairs.
Well, true. She is not a experienced foreign policy type as Joe Biden, for instance, has been, right? But I wonder to what extent this is really that decisive. I think from the Europeans' point of view, it's much more important where she stands. And even before she became the candidate for the Democrats, the Europeans saw her at the Munich Security Conference. And there, she was very much in line with Joe Biden's position. So the expectations, I cannot look into the head of Kamala Harris, but from what she's done and said so far and the way she's perceived in Europe, the Europeans would expect continuity in terms of the policies, even with regard to Gaza, right? The Gaza war, where she seems to stand a little bit, seems to be a little bit more pro-Palestine, but I think she is a politician enough to understand, as the President of the United States of America, she needs, and that comes back to Thomas's point about the polarization, right? That the room of maneuver is limited. So we would expect certain continuity with her compared to the Biden administration, right, Thomas?
But make no mistake, I think Europeans are increasingly aware about that burden sharing issue.
Yeah.
So there's some illusions about a Kamala Harris administration in the sense of that they let the Europeans off the hook. I find that absolutely unlikely because the domestic controversies about U.S. foreign policy are going to increase rather than decrease.
Yeah.
And I think most political quarters in Europe have understood this now.
Yeah.
That to a very large extent Europe has to take care of its own defense in light of the whole Russian situation, and we are doing it. The point is, if we talk about Germany, we have some running up to do here. Yeah, so it takes some time. But I think most of the political elites across the political spectrum have understood that by now.
And we have a question back here, which I think is not about astronomy, right?
No. So the flaws of America and the polarization of America is open for the world and it's been discussed. But as an American looking to Europe, I worry about the structural stability of the European community. You've touched upon Italy, France, and Germany, and right-wing movements within there. You didn't mention Turkey and Hungary, which are also part of the greater European community. I worry about that community, which does things basically by requiring unanimous consent, that the European community itself might be fragile. We see Hungary and Turkey sort of sitting on the fence, leaning maybe a little to Russia. What happens to the European alliance? Structurally, how could the alliance or NATO or the EU handle it if there are significant shifts to the right and all of a sudden there's the impossibility of unanimity?
Well, that's a great question. I'll try to be really brief because obviously, the European Union has 27 member states. It's an entire another talk. But let me say this: it will depend a lot on what the so-called mainstream parties do. Right? We have a far right rising. We also have a far left. Let's not forget about that. Particularly in Germany, the so-called Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht. She is a former member of the East German Stalinist Party. Then she became a prominent member of the so-called left. Now she created her own party, and that party is on the rise. And so we have the far left and the far right, right? So the question is what the mainstream parties do. And you're absolutely right, they've moved to the right on issues like migration, climate change, gender, and or more generally LGBTIQ+ rights. For sure, but they haven't, I mean, for me, the proof of the pudding is to what extent they stand by democracy and the rule of law, right? So it's on policy issues, the mainstream, a lot of the mainstream parties, not all, and not in all countries, but there's a general trend of the mainstream parties moving to the right, particularly on certain issues, and on issues that are mobilized by the far right and the far left, migration being the point, the case in point. But so far, they stand with the institutional issue, right? They're not turning against, they're not trying. The big danger for democracy everywhere is not a coup d'etat, right? Or a revolution. It is democratically elected enemies of democracy who use democracy to abolish democracy, right? And so far, so good. But we have to see what Meloni is doing in Italy. We have to see what a French president, Marine Le Pen, will do to stay in power. And that has been the example of Hungary, right? I mean, Orban, he got elected with a huge landslide. And he used that majority to slowly but surely erode democratic institutions. And that is something we're seeing in Europe and different countries. And if this is going to continue, we have a cause of concern. Last point, in terms of the Europeans being united, given the fact that Hungary currently has the EU presidency, I was quite surprised to see how united the Europeans are. The Europeans have managed to sort of contain Orban, despite the travel he did, and so far so good. So I'm not concerned about the Europeans being united or not. I'm more concerned what certain European leaders, once elected, will do to democratic institutions. That's a far bigger threat in my view.
But you're repeating my concern. What institutions within the EU exist that could handle a breach if it occurs far worse than we currently do?
Okay, well, let me say, and then Thomas gets it right. The European Union is not the solution to that problem. If you believe the European Union can stop democratic regression in the member states, that is a false belief. The European Union can also not democratize countries. It can support democratizing forces. Thomas, can you switch off your phone? It's probably Stephanie telling us that she's on her way. So, but I mean, the European Union is not the solution. It's the society. It's the people, right, in the member states that need to stop voting for parties that have the intention to erode and eventually abolish democracy. That is the problem. The EU can do nothing to stop that.
Okay.
Of course, Turkey is not a member of the EU.
And Turkey is not a member of the EU and will not become a member of the EU as long as Erdogan is in power. But let's not forget that Turkey is as split as probably the US. The presidential elections in Turkey were extremely close. All the big cities are now controlled by the opposition. And given the Turkish political system, Erdogan is very much domestically constrained. My big concern, talking about the EU can handle Hungary. No. It was able, yes it can. So not in terms of democratic erosion, having a spillover effect of blocking EU business. That has not happened. You know, they've found all, we can talk about this for ages, they found all kinds of interesting solutions how to prevail, even though Hungary threatened to veto really important decisions like the accession talks to Ukraine. Orban simply left the room and the vote was taken. So they came up with innovative solutions. The big concern is very different in my view. It's France. France is as split as the United States. And Marine Le Pen as the president of France. The EU cannot do much without France or without Germany, but I'm not that concerned about Germany despite all these other parties. So my big concern in this whole discussion, and we might want to talk about this next year, when we're closer to the presidential elections in France. And German elections. But that would be my big concern. Because a lot of the stuff that we want to do as Europeans, we cannot do without France.
We've got another question back here, and then I'm going to bring the microphone back to where you can see me. So get your questions ready.
I'm a supporter of Israel, looking forward to...
Yes.
I am a supporter of Israel, looking forward to peace. And it seems to me that whatever the solutions might be, they ought to include the other Sunni nations of that region. And that hasn't happened at this point. And I wonder if it isn't time to get them engaged, because I believe in terms of managing Gaza beyond the conflict, those nations are essential.
I completely and 100% agree. So if we think we have a ceasefire, and that's the precondition, okay? The cessation of hostilities there. We need Jordan getting in. We probably need Saudi Arabia getting in, and Egypt, plus the United States.
No. Yeah.
The Europeans can do a lot in terms of humanitarian aid and reconstruction. One enormous issue that is sometimes not really realized in the political discussions we have is that we by now have two populations that are deeply and deeply traumatized. Yeah? The Israelis, because they felt secure, they thought nothing can really happen to them. A little bit, the occasional rocket from Hamas but that kind of massacre that happened there, that led to all our Israeli friends, and we have a lot of Israeli friends. We both are also visiting professors at an Israeli university. They are very deeply traumatized. And if you have 6 months of war in the Gaza in the way we had it, with people having to leave their homes, and the homes get destroyed, then they have to leave. They have to move back and forth every time. I cannot imagine how traumatized these people are. And that is going to be a major, major issue in the next 10 years.
I just want to add one thing. For Germany, Israel, the security of Israel is part of our state identity. We Germans feel we have a very strong responsibility towards Israel. Now, the point is, the current government of Israel makes it very difficult to honor that commitment. And I come back to this hypocrisy issue, right? The Israeli government, with its current, how shall I put that, the way it is fighting the war in Gaza makes it increasingly more difficult for countries like Germany, and in the European Union we get increasingly more isolated because of our unconditional support for Israel. So I like to distinguish between Israel and the Israeli government. The current government is increasingly becoming a problem for supporting Israel, right? And that goes back to the issue of hypocrisy. If the Israeli government continues to commit war crimes in Gaza and in the in the West Bank, it will become increasingly more difficult for a country like Germany to stand with Israel. And here comes the US in. You're absolutely right, sir. The Sunni, particularly the Sunni Arab nations, need to get involved in building this peace in the region. And the only country that can make them engage is the United States of America. But also because it's the only country that has sufficient leverage over the current government to make Netanyahu do something that is most likely end his government, right? And bring him into prison. So again, the US is really crucial here. And so I just felt I had to say that also as a German who stands with Israel.
Yeah, we still have time. Other questions?
You know, I was interested, you mentioned Mexico. You didn't mention Mexico. Mexico is far and away the wealthiest country in Latin America now on a per capita basis, and they seem to have very bright prospects. You know, people like Jimmy Dimon, which is at Citibank or Wells Fargo, or whatever it is, you know, he said, if you're thinking about investing in a foreign country, the most likely bet right now is Mexico.
And it's happening. Some of the investment diversion now from China goes into Mexico from the US.
Because people want to be, they don't want to have a long supply chain anymore. They want to have a near supply chain. And Mexico, of course, since the 2008, was it, financial crisis, more Mexicans have returned to Mexico than have come to the United States. So there's essentially no illegal immigration at all from Mexico now. And Mexicans are, you know, when I talk to people down there, they say, well, I make more money in the United States, but I live better down here. People don't understand that. It's very difficult to do legally. Anyway, that's my comment. I don't know if you have a comment on that or not.
No, absolutely. I mean, Mexico, for the reasons that was already mentioned, there's also another reason why Mexico is super interesting, because Mexico, again, it's an emerging economy. It's not at the same scale as particularly, well, Brazil, we have to see, but, you know, South Africa. But Mexico is certainly among the wider group of countries. And it's also a country that claims to be a democracy, but has a leadership that, you could argue, is also trying to dismantle some core rule of law institutions, right, in order to stay in power. And so again, I think this is the biggest threat to the West. China and Russia, as long as we stand together, I'm not concerned. The problem comes from within, from political forces who claim to defend democracy, and in the name of democracy, dismantle democracy. We've seen this in Europe in a more subtle way. I'm always looking at Fede. I hope Fede you agree, but what Meloni is doing, they're going after, it's always the same script. They're going after the independent, the free media. They're going after the autonomous civil society organizations with the NGO, the foreign agent laws. They're going after academic freedom. And most importantly, they're going against the independence of the judiciary, the independent courts, right? Always arguing this constrains true democracy. It sort of perverts the true will of the people, right? So, and that is a real danger. We can talk about how much power central banks should should have and how much power courts should have and to what extent politics should be allowed to delegate decision-making authority to so-called non-majoritarian institutions, i.e. institutions that are not controlled by majorities. But there is clear evidence that these institutions have helped to sustain democracy, and attempts to do away with these institutions represent a danger to democracy, and that comes from within the West, not from the outside. Supported, though, by Russia and by China, yes, that's true, too.
Quick questions, we have time. Let me bring this up.
I have a big mouth, I don't need a microphone. So, one thing that we really haven't discussed much is climate change and a instability that I see as the 400-pound gorilla. I can think of probably 4 countries in the world that will benefit substantially from global warming. The danger is one of them is Russia, and so far Putin has been very shrewd about not trumpeting his, Russia being in favor of global warming. But the danger is that if the rest of the world gets its act together, and maybe we might be, then all Russia has to do is burn its coal, and it can undo all of the investment that especially Europe, but now the US and China have been placing in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Russia can undo that single-handedly, and I don't see any way to control Russia. So it seems to me it's an unstable problem. Your thoughts?
Russia, again, it's the same answer as with regard to democracy. Yes, Russia is a big issue for global warming, but at the moment I'm much more concerned, at least in Europe, about us reneging on the so-called Green Deal. The Green Deal is dead upon arrival. All these big commitments, and promises, particularly Ursula von der Leyen, the former and new president of the European Commission, it's gone. And this is a problem, but there is a reason for that. And I think what people tend to forget, global warming is also a social issue, right? And if we don't deal with the costs of fighting climate change, which are not equally distributed across the population, if you simply say we need to reduce greenhouse gases, I'm all with you. But if we do not consider the distributional consequences, we won't get anywhere. And then Russia is one problem. But again, I think we need to start looking at our own problems too. And I just don't see that at the moment. At the moment, with the move to the right, there's a lot of kicking the can down the road, and let's not get to the redistributional consequences of fighting climate change. So again, we can't do much about Russia, but what we can do is tackling the issues of the social costs of fighting climate change in our own societies, and there is a lot to be done. And simply issuing regulation, I'm afraid, won't do the trick.
On Russia. Yes, Russia is the big winner, particularly because if the permafrost in Siberia melts, there are all these energy reserves. At the moment, Russia has absolutely not the technology.
Good point.
This is something where the sanctions really work. Russia has no technology to actually exploit this at the moment. As for burning coal, etc., if Russia wants to shoot itself in the foot, it can do so. The problem is that global warming doesn't stop at the border. Either you do something collectively, or you all hang separately. That's the problem with this. So I'm not that concerned. I'm concerned about what Tanja said, even though I'm a little. I think the global markets have understood this now, that the move is toward getting out of fossil fuels and toward renewables. I mean, big companies cannot change their business model every 2 weeks just because one leader in one country changes direction. So these are long-term type of strategy. My sense is they have understood it. However, the backlash we see in Europe at the moment is something else. For the very first time, it hits home. Yeah? If Germany issues a law according to which you have to get rid of your oil heatings, by a certain amount of time, and you have each household has to invest 10,000 of euro to put into new heating systems. No wonder that people get upset about this. That was, in my view, absolutely to be expected. And then we can talk for the next hour about the stupidity of the German government.
But it's also the farmers. It's not only.
No, yeah, but it's hitting home now.
Yeah.
It's really hitting home now.
It looks like we might have 2 questions. Maybe we'll start here. We'll collect it.
We collect it, and you can just.
Hi. I was wondering if you would comment on the impact or lack of impact that all the disinformation and lack of strong media reporting on what's going on in elections.
Sometimes also we collect, yeah.
Do you have one more question?
Yeah, this should be simple. Just how would we stop the division in our country? So.
I mean, the two questions are somewhat related because sometimes I ask myself whether media reporting is part of the solution or part of the problem, actually, right? So we really have, the media can make a difference in a positive and in a negative sense. And social media has done a lot of damage to what we call the public sphere, right? So, and it's getting now and also at the sort of the more serious, the print media. But so the media is again, it's very ambiguous, right? So I'm not sure whether more media reporting about these international issues would help. It depends on what kind of media reporting you get. That brings me to the second questions about the polarization. What Thomas alluded to, and that was a slide we took out in the interest of time, is there are different types of polarization. And the polarization of what we call the mass, the society, isn't that great. It's the elites that have a keen incentive to polarize, right? So, and the American political system in particular, kind of ironically, because it was built, the checks and balances was actually built to make people reach across the aisle and foster compromise. But the way, and the media is part of the problem, the politics work at the moment gives the institutions of the United States, and the party system and everything, incentivizes political elites to polarize. And the media helps a lot, right? So the interesting thing is that society is much less polarized than we tend to have the impression, right? The question is, how do you actually stop elites polarizing, right? And well, you don't reward them. So if you ask me, one way as a voter, what you can do is you don't vote for politicians who polarize. And when I mean polarize, I don't mean taking a clear stance. I mean degrading the other as the enemy, as the immoral enemy that needs to be fought at the beaches, right? Not as a political opponent, but as the enemy. That's what we call effective polarization. So you don't see people who disagree with you anymore as people, as having a legitimate disagreement, but as the enemy. And there are politicians who do that. And that, by rewarding them, right? You contribute, and by rewarding politicians who try to depoliticize, who try to, right, to argue on the basis of facts rather than try to steer fear and anger. I think that would be one way. And for parties, again, I mean, we're talking about the far right now in Europe, for instance. I think it is super important to take the grievances of the people seriously, and be it the cost of fighting climate change or the fears of immigration, right? And these fears are real, and these far right and far left populist parties are particularly effective in mobilizing these grievances, and then blaming certain groups, the elites or the migrants or whomever, for the grievances. But you need to take these grievances seriously, right? Because they won't go away. And so there's several things you can do, right? But I think it is important to keep in mind that the societies in general are not as polarized as the elites try to make them, right?
And maybe the only way in the US system you can do this is through the primary system. Through the primary system. I mean, that's the problem, because you have, I mean, let's face it, Wyoming is completely irrelevant for the US presidential election. So are pretty much all electoral districts except 20 to 25. This is where the presidential election is being decided. You know, we all know about the battleground states. It's not even the battleground states. I mean, if you think about Arizona, it's some suburbs around Phoenix that will decide that election. Or you can do the same with Pennsylvania, etc. Yeah? So the only way out is make sure that moderate people on either side are not punished through the primary system. Now, this is a hard call, because in the primary system, usually the 150% type of people vote. Yeah? So the primary system at the moment fosters the polarization. Last point, have discussions like this one. We don't care here whether you are a registered Democrat, a registered Republican, a registered Independent, or know nothing. Let's start talking about the issues rather than coloring everything in these partisan forms. I give you an example that has nothing to do, or little to do with international politics. Abortion is a hugely controversial issue in the US, and is actually across the world. Sometimes you think, hey, one group wants to kill babies, and the other one wants to kill the other group wants to kill the mothers. You know, that is not the conversation. If you look at the world and different solution now, it's
not black and white.
It's not
lots of shades of gray.
There are lots of shades, and there's room for a lot of disagreement, but also for agreement, etc.
Compromise.
And for compromise. You know, this is what politics is about, and we have to relearn this. You know, compromise is not a bad word. Yeah, it's essential.
It's the essence of democratic politics, actually, right?
And today's majority can become tomorrow's minority. That's how it is. All right, let's have barbecue now.